Imagine if everything you thought you knew about Neanderthals was completely off the mark. For decades, they've been portrayed as crude, slow-witted cavemen, destined to vanish in the shadow of our so-called superiority. But what if that narrative was all wrong? What if Neanderthals were actually extraordinary beings, resilient, intelligent, deeply attuned to their surroundings? These were people who weathered ice ages, hunted with remarkable accuracy, and even looked after their sick and elderly. Today, we're digging up the truth behind that distorted image to piece together a story that was never told properly. Neanderthals weren't a primitive stepping stone. They were a remarkable branch of the human story. Get ready to see them in a whole new light. Roughly 400,000 years ago, Earth was anything but gentle. The world Neanderthals called home was wild, unpredictable, and unforgiving. It wasn't a single, stable environment. It was a relentless cycle of freezing and thawing. Europe, their primary stomping ground, swung between brutal ice ages and short-lived warmer spells. Picture vast treeless steppes stretching to the horizon, towering mountains sheathed in ice, and a cold so intense it would drive most of us indoors, if there had been doors to hide behind. Back then, climate wasn't just a backdrop, it was a force of nature that shaped life itself. During glacial peaks, massive ice sheets crept slowly across the land, forcing humans and animals alike to retreat south. When the ice pulled back, life surged north once again, as if the earth had exhaled. In this endless dance of advance and retreat, survival meant adaptability. And Neanderthals didn't just endure, they mastered it. Their world was full of hardship. Forests were rare, open plains and tundra dominated. Winters could stretch for 9 grueling months. There were no farms, no permanent shelters, just survival in its rawest form. But these trials forged something remarkable. Neanderthals became evolution's answer to the cold, sturdy, stocky, incredibly strong. With compact builds and thick muscles, their bodies were tailor-made for conserving warmth and enduring the brutal demands of their world. And nature didn't pull punches when it came to neighbors. They shared the land with woolly mammoths, rhinos in winter coats, cave bears and saber-toothed predators. The line between hunter and hunted was razor thin. Every successful hunt was a triumph. Every misstep could be fatal. Life was a constant test of skill, nerve, and instinct. This wasn't a Europe of countries or cities. It was a fractured wilderness divided by rivers, ice, and impassable terrain. Human bands were scattered, often separated by vast distances. As a result, knowledge traveled slowly. Each group crafted its own tools, developed its own ways of coping. Yet despite their isolation, Neanderthals adapted brilliantly to their local environments. Forest dwellers used different technologies than their steppe-roaming cousins. Innovation for them was born from necessity. Their world was quiet, devoid of engines, machines, and electric lights. The only soundtrack was wind, animal calls, and the stealthy footfalls of a hunter on the trail. In that silence, Neanderthals became highly attuned to their surroundings. They could read the land with astonishing accuracy, tracking prey, interpreting signs and understanding migration cycles with skills that rival modern experts. They didn't need maps. The landscape was etched into their memory. They didn't write, but they surely spoke and shared stories beside the fire. Though the world was harsh, Neanderthals didn't just fight against it, they became a part of it. They moved in rhythm with the seasons, the storms, the migrations. The earth they knew looked nothing like ours. It was a crucible, one that tested every creature to the limit. And from that trial emerged one of the most resilient, resourceful human species ever to walk this planet. While others faded away, Neanderthals endured. They were the ember that refused to go out, the stone that wouldn't crack. In a world shaped by ice and danger, they rose, not just to survive, but to thrive. From that frozen forge came a lineage unlike any other. In the harsh, icy wilderness of the ancient world, Neanderthals weren't wandering through a desolate landscape alone. They lived among a breathtaking array of now extinct creatures and even other human species. Yet, amidst that diversity, Neanderthals stood out. Forged by nature's raw brutality and shaped by evolution's careful hand, they were more than survivors. They were marvels of biology and culture. Homo neanderthalensis wasn't some awkward cousin trailing behind Homo sapiens. They were a fully fledged human species, rich in complexity, skill, and intelligence. Emerging around 400,000 years ago, they thrived across Europe and parts of Western Asia for over 350,000 years. A staggering span, especially when compared to the relatively brief chapter of written human history. While their stature was modest, about 1.65 meters for men and 1.55 for women, their strength was anything but. They were built for endurance with powerful frames, broad chests, and thick limbs. Their skulls bore pronounced brow ridges and large nasal cavities, adaptations likely designed to warm freezing air before it reached their lungs. Injuries didn't easily take them out. Many bore the scars of healed fractures, evidence of their physical toughness and resilience. In a direct physical contest, a Neanderthal might very well overpower most modern humans, but their most astonishing trait wasn't their brute strength, it was their mind. Neanderthals crafted tools with precision and foresight. They utilized the Mousterian technique, an advanced stone knapping method that let them shape tools with care and purpose, blades, scrapers, and spear points fashioned from carefully chosen stone. These weren't improvised weapons, they were the result of deep understanding and refined skill. Some of these tools are so effective that modern researchers can still use them to butcher meat with surgical accuracy. They also had full command of fire, not just to stay warm, but to cook, harden wood, and create social spaces. Campsites show evidence of organized living, fire pits, distinct areas for sleeping and working, and even stone circles placed around hearths. These weren't random arrangements, they reveal planning, cooperation, and a sense of community. Neanderthals didn't live in isolation. They formed tight-knit groups and looked after their own. Archaeologists have found remains of individuals who lived for years with injuries or disabilities, proof they were cared for, fed, and valued, even when they couldn't contribute to hunting or labor. That kind of empathy speaks volumes. It wasn't just survival, it was compassion. They buried their dead too. In caves like Shanidar in present-day Iraq, bodies were laid to rest with deliberate care. Some were even accompanied by traces of pollen suggesting floral offerings. Whether or not they believed in an afterlife, one thing is clear. They didn't treat death casually. They mourned. They remembered, and they shared their frozen world with giants, woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats like Homotherium, rhinos wrapped in fur, towering bison, and cave bears as tall as doorways. Some of these animals were hunted, others avoided, but either way, they demanded strategy. Taking down a mammoth wasn't brute force alone. It required coordinated effort, planning, and communication. Neanderthals excelled at all of it. They weren't the only human species around either. They likely evolved from Homo heidelbergensis and overlapped with others like the Denisovans. They even crossed paths and genes with early Homo sapiens. In fact, if you have ancestry from Europe or Asia, you probably carry a bit of Neanderthal DNA yourself. Our evolutionary trees don't run parallel, they intertwine. As for language, the question lingers. Did Neanderthals speak as we do? We may never know for sure, but they had the anatomy for it. The hyoid bone and key genes like FOXP2 suggest they had some form of complex communication. Maybe they used words, maybe signs, maybe a mix of sounds and gestures. Whatever the case, they likely shared stories around firelight, warnings, legends, lessons passed down through generations. Neanderthals weren't an early draft of humanity. They were a brilliant, fully realized branch, just as capable, just as worthy of awe. In the frozen heart of the Pleistocene, they carved out a legacy that still echoes in our bones. Their story challenges us to rethink not just who they were, but what it means to be human. Surviving in the Neanderthal world wasn't just about raw strength. It was a delicate balance of ingenuity and adaptation, seizing opportunities while constantly navigating dangers. In this unforgiving environment, they didn't just survive. They perfected some of the most advanced survival tactics seen in human history, long before agriculture, cities, or written language came into play. They did it with sharp minds, strong communities, and acute observation. Neanderthals were hunters. But not just any hunters. They were elite predators. They faced giants, wild herds, and animals that could kill with a single strike. But they didn't rely on brute force alone. Armed with fire-hardened wooden spears, sharp stone tools, and most importantly, flawless teamwork, they were formidable. Archaeological sites like La Côte de Saint-Brelade reveal that Neanderthals pushed mammoth herds toward cliffs, forcing the massive animals to plunge to their deaths. This wasn't instinct, it was strategic, collective planning. They hunted, together as a cohesive unit, much like a wolf pack. They communicated in some form, assigned roles and charted the best routes. Some would hide, others would drive the animals toward their doom, and some waited for the precise moment to strike. Their hunts were meticulously coordinated, almost like a well-choreographed dance. In many ways, their hunting strategies were akin to those of modern predators, like lions, wolves, or even military tactics. But Neanderthals weren't just after the largest game. They understood the value of seizing every available opportunity. Smaller prey, such as wild goats, deer, and birds, were also on their radar. They gathered wild fruits, tubers, and seeds, and in coastal areas, evidence suggests they even harvested shellfish. These were intelligent, resourceful omnivores who knew when to take risks and when to play it safe. One of their greatest feats was their mastery over fire. Fire was far more than a tool for warmth. It was central to nearly every aspect of Neanderthal life. They used it to cook food, making it more digestible, tastier, and safer to eat. They hardened wood to craft better spears and used fire to fend off nocturnal predators. Imagine a dark night in a cold cave, surrounded by wild wolves and cave bears. Fire was the barrier between life and death. Speaking of caves, Neanderthals were discerning when it came to choosing shelter. They sought caves with narrow entrances, easily defensible but well ventilated, close to resources. Evidence shows that they organized their living spaces. Fire pits were centered in the camp, with distinct areas for tools, food, and even places to work or craft. Some caves contained evidence of stone tools being carved and animal skins being cured. This indicates a level of domestic organization and cultural complexity that's often underestimated. Their clothing was another example of their ingenuity. In an environment where temperatures could drop to 20 degrees Celsius, wearing skins wasn't a luxury, it was a matter of survival. While they didn't have modern needles, they used bones or thorns to fasten skins together, creating layered garments that offered much-needed protection against the cold. And then there were their observation skills. Neanderthals could read the land with an almost uncanny precision. They could track animals, interpret weather patterns, and recognize dangerous situations. Their hands, broad and strong, were tools in themselves, capable of crafting delicate items with remarkable precision. These weren't just muscle-bound hunters. They were artisans, capable of detailed work that requires fine motor skills and sensitivity. They also understood the natural world in ways we are just beginning to comprehend. Traces of medicinal plants, like poplar, which contains salicylic acid, the main ingredient in aspirin, have been found in Neanderthal dental remains. This suggests they knew how to ease pain or reduce fever. In some sites, like El Cedrón in Spain, evidence points to the use of antibiotic fungi in their diets. These were not primitive creatures. They were capable of self-medication, drawing on nature's resources for healing. But perhaps their most powerful survival strategy was social cohesion. Life in a group wasn't just about hunting or staying warm. It was about sharing knowledge, protecting the vulnerable, and raising children together. Trust within the group was essential. In a world where any misstep could lead to death, mutual reliance was the glue that held them together. Neanderthals weren't solitary figures. They were interdependent, forming strong, resilient communities. In the end, Neanderthals weren't accidental survivors. They were the product of hundreds of thousands of years of intelligence, adaptation, and creativity. Every tool they crafted, every animal they hunted, every injury they healed, each spoke of a species that didn't just survive, but thrived in one of the most hostile environments Earth has ever known. Today, when we judge them, it's easy to forget that they lived without modern comforts, and yet they dominated their world in ways that modern humans can admire. For countless millennia, Neanderthals thrived across Europe and Western Asia, not through conquest but by sheer resilience. But even the most well-prepared species can be overwhelmed by forces beyond their control. The world, ever shifting, began to change, and those changes, gradual but unstoppable, would challenge everything the Neanderthals had learned to endure. Around 60,000 years ago, Earth entered one of its most intense cooling periods. The last ice age, known as isotopic stage 4, began to take hold. Temperatures plummeted dramatically. Vast stretches of northern land froze permanently. Glaciers advanced like rivers of ice, and the landscapes they carved were forever altered. Forests vanished, replaced by cold, barren steppes, where harsh winds swept unimpeded. The familiar world of the Neanderthals was beginning to fade, but the cold wasn't their only adversary. As temperatures dropped, many animal species either migrated south or faced extinction. The once abundant food sources of the Neanderthals became more scattered. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, and other large prey were no longer in their usual territories, and some herds failed to return to familiar valleys. Hunting became more difficult and required longer journeys, greater risks, and a need to adapt to shifting landscapes. And it wasn't only the climate that changed. Competition increased as well. Around 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, our ancestors, arrived in Europe. Coming from Africa, they passed through the Middle East and moved into territories that had been dominated by the Neanderthals. This wasn't the brutal invasion often imagined, but rather a more nuanced and complex process. Homo sapiens brought new hunting methods, improved tools, and more sophisticated social structures. They introduced more efficient weapons, such as throwing spears and later the bow and arrow. Their social networks were broader, connecting distant groups, and they shared knowledge faster. Some even domesticated wild dogs, forever changing their ability to hunt and protect their communities. In this new reality, the Neanderthals found themselves increasingly isolated. Their communities shrank in size, and mobility became more limited. As the weather grew harsher, many groups became trapped between mountains, valleys, or icy coasts. They could no longer migrate freely as they once had. Their territories became fragmented, and with this isolation came a decline in genetic diversity. This decline is crucial. Fossil DNA studies suggest that by their final centuries, Neanderthals existed in small, scattered groups, often with little contact with each other. With endogamy, reproduction among close relatives becoming inevitable, their genetic pool shrank. Harmful mutations accumulated, further reducing their adaptability. The wear and tear wasn't just physical or environmental, it was genetic as well. Meanwhile, natural disasters compounded the challenges they faced. Around 39,000 years ago, the eruption of the Phlegraean Field supervolcano blanketed large parts of Europe with ash. While the full extent of the eruption's impact is still debated, it likely devastated the already fragile Neanderthal population. Vegetation disappeared in many areas, animals fled, and the air became toxic. Extreme natural events began to pile up, and Neanderthals found themselves increasingly isolated in the face of chaos. Still, they didn't give up. Some Neanderthals adjusted their diets, as evidenced by remains found in the El Cidrón cave in Spain, where they consumed moss, mushrooms, and tree bark. Others began to use mineral pigments, possibly for symbolic or ritual purposes. One of the most stunning discoveries came from the La Pasiega cave, where cave paintings were found dating back over 64,000 years, predating the arrival of Homo sapiens. If these paintings were indeed created by Neanderthals, it would radically shift our understanding of their artistic and symbolic capabilities. Yet no matter how remarkable their achievements were, the tide of change was relentless. The climate grew harsher, the cold became more intense, external pressures mounted. Homo sapiens weren't just superior in technology or genetics, they were also more mobile, connected, and numerous. As they expanded, they gradually took over more territory. It's possible that in some regions, Neanderthals were absorbed by Homo sapiens, blending into the larger human population. Over time, they ceased to be Neanderthals and became part of us. After all, a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA still runs through our veins, but before that integration, there were conflicts, there was adaptation, there was hope. The world was changing, and the Neanderthals, with all their strength, intelligence, and determination, fought to adapt. But some forces, no matter how extraordinary the species, were simply too much to overcome. After nearly 400,000 years of existence, Neanderthals faced their ultimate challenge: extinction. However, the end of their species wasn't a sudden or singular event. Their disappearance was a slow, drawn-out process marked by their failure to adapt to a constantly changing world. No single catastrophe or singular cause wiped them out, but rather a series of compounding factors. One major factor in their decline was climate change. While extreme cold had been a constant challenge, the warming that came with the end of the Ice Age, around 12,000 years ago, introduced a different kind of stress. As temperatures rose and forests reclaimed the land, ecosystems shifted. Species that had thrived in cold, open environments were displaced, and this change directly impacted the resources that Neanderthals relied on. Though they had weathered past climatic shifts, this one was uniquely disruptive. The arrival of Homo sapiens around 45,000 years ago intensified competition for resources. Homo sapiens brought with them advanced hunting tools, new strategies, and a remarkable capacity for innovation. They adapted to environmental changes faster and created technologies that allowed them to hunt more efficiently, communicate more effectively, and collaborate on a broader scale. Their ability to transmit knowledge through symbols, art, and shared culture gave them a cultural edge as well. But the competition wasn't just technological. Homo sapiens also introduced diseases to which Neanderthals had no immunity. In a world where herd immunity didn't exist, new illnesses could devastate populations already struggling in harsh conditions. Combined with food scarcity and mounting tensions, these pressures likely accelerated the decline of Neanderthals. Genetically, Neanderthals were in a vulnerable state. Their populations had become increasingly isolated in their final millennia. Low genetic diversity and inbreeding increased their susceptibility to diseases and harmful mutations. With limited gene flow and no chance for genetic replenishment, Neanderthals were less equipped to adapt to the rapidly changing world around them. Another key factor in their decline was the social and cultural advances of Homo sapiens. While Neanderthals were undoubtedly intelligent and had their own culture, Homo sapiens evolved more complex ways of life. They engaged in organized hunting, built permanent shelters, used advanced clothing, and domesticated animals. These developments gave them a distinct advantage over the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals' disappearance wasn't abrupt. It was more gradual. Instead of a mass extinction event, there was a blending of species. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred, exchanged ideas and cultural practices, and shared genes. Scientific evidence confirms that modern humans, especially those outside of Africa, carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. This genetic mixing didn't mean the Neanderthals simply faded away. Their legacy lives on in us. Their DNA influences our biology in ways that are still apparent today, such as in how our bodies respond to cold, process certain foods, and fight diseases. Some of our traits, like skin characteristics and disease resistance, are traces of that ancient lineage. Nevertheless, as a distinct species, Neanderthals vanished around 30,000 years ago. Their extinction was a complex process involving environmental changes, competition with Homo sapiens, disease, and genetic isolation. While they might have survived longer in some regions, the eventual blending with Homo sapiens sealed their fate. To this day, the exact cause of their extinction remains a subject of debate. Was it the competition with Homo sapiens that pushed them over the edge? Or was it environmental shifts? Or perhaps both? What is clear, though, is that Neanderthals were not a mere precursor to Homo sapiens, but a species in their own right, sharing many of the traits that define us as humans. Their extinction leaves us with an invaluable lesson. Our history is more intricate and multifaceted than we often think. Neanderthals remind us that we are not the only players in this story of evolution. Our survival and future are just as uncertain as theirs were, and the history of life on Earth is still unfolding. We are the latest chapter, but the story is far from over. The story of the Neanderthals is ultimately a powerful lesson in adaptability, resilience, and transformation. For hundreds of thousands of years, they survived in a world filled with danger and unpredictability, enduring harsh climates, competing with powerful predators, and constantly adjusting to a changing landscape. Their success wasn't just built on brute strength, but on creativity, cooperation, and a deep understanding of their environment. And though their extinction was a loss, it wasn't the end of their story. Their legacy lives on, in our genes, in our biology, and perhaps even in our instincts. That small trace of Neanderthal DNA within us is a reminder that we are part of a much longer, richer human journey. It's a silent inheritance that still plays a role in how we cope with cold, processed food and respond to disease. More importantly, their story holds a mirror up to our present. Like the Neanderthals, we too live in a time of profound environmental change. Climate shifts, species, extinctions, and resource challenges are no longer distant threats, they're happening now. The question is, are we adapting quickly enough? The rise and fall of the Neanderthals reminds us that no species, no matter how advanced or resilient, is immune to the forces of nature and time. But it also teaches us that survival depends not just on technology, but on collaboration, adaptability, and the ability to learn from the past. As we look ahead, we must ask ourselves, will we be wise enough to avoid the missteps that led others to vanish? Will we come together as a global community to face the shared challenges of our age? The Neanderthals may be gone, but their presence still echoes through us. Their story is a warning, but also a source of inspiration. The future is not fixed. It's shaped by the choices we make now. And just as they once rose to meet a world in flux, so must we.